So if you want to just keep your Bibles open and turn to Ezra chapter 4. Ezra chapter 4, it's found on page 460 in the Black Pew Bible. And in the bulletin, there are some notes. And if you're visiting with us, we want to thank you for being here and welcome here. And also in the bulletin, there's a little tear-off sheet, a connection sheet. And if you would like to, fill that out at the end of, during the service. And at the end of the service, we'll have an offering. And if you want to place that in the offering plate, it's an opportunity that we as a church can pray for you, a way just to remember your names and just have a record of your visit here. And we thank you for taking the time out of your vacation during this weekend, to be with us and to worship and encourage us. And also, if you would like, you can find, if you've downloaded our app, you can find under the app sermon notes, and you can follow along if you want to do that as well. But so you have either paper or digital, whichever one you want. Or if you just don't want to take notes, don't worry, nobody's going to judge you openly, but no, just joking, but no. So we're continuing our series on this idea of restoration in the book of Ezra. So what I'm going to do is that over next week, we're going to look at 3 chapters in 1 week. So we're not going to read all of it. But what I'm going to do, even though this is a letter written to a couple kings that we've probably never even heard of, but I think it's important for us to, I want to read the whole chapter today because I think it shows that what they went through is the stuff that we are going through each and every day. Chapter 4, beginning with verse 1. Now when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple to the Lord, the God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel and the heads of the fathers' houses and said to them, "Let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do. And we've been sacrificing to him ever since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here. But Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the rest of the heads of the father's house in Israel said to them, you have nothing to do with us in building the house to God, but we alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us." Then the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build and bribed counselors against them to frustrate their purpose all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia as well. Verse 6, and in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. In the days of Artaxerxes, Bishlam, and Mithridath, and Tabeel, and the rest of the associations wrote to Artaxerxes, king of Persia. The letter was written in Aramaic and translated. Rehum, the commander, and Shimshai, the scribe, wrote a letter against Jerusalem to Artaxerxes, the king, as follows. Rehum and the commander Shimshai, the scribe and the rest of their associates, the judges, the governors, the officials, the Persians, the men of Iraq, the Babylonians, the men of Susa, and this is Elamites, and the rest of the nations whom the great and noble Onsnapper, oh, don't you love that name, Onsnapper? Yeah, sounds like a fish or a turtle. Deported and settled in the cities of Samaria and the rest of the province beyond the river. Verse 11, this is the copy of the letter that they sent. To Artaxerxes, the king, your servants and the men of the province beyond the river send you greetings. And now be it known to the king, the Jews who came up from you to us have gone to Jerusalem. They are rebuilding the rebellious and wicked city. They are finishing the walls and repairing the foundations. Now be it known to the king that if this city is rebuilt and the walls finished, they will not pay tribute, custom, or toll, and the royal revenue will be impaired. Now because we eat the salt of the palace, and it is not fitting for us to witness the king's dishonor, therefore we send and inform the king, in the order that each may be made in the book of the records of your fathers, who will find in the book of the records and learn that this city is a rebellious city, hurtful to the kings and provinces, and the sedition was stirred up in from of old. That was why the city was laid waste. We make known to the king that if this city is rebuilt and its walls finished, You will then have no possession in the province beyond the river. Verse 17, and the king sent an answer to Rehum, the commander, and Shimshai, the scribe, and the rest of their associates who live in Samaria and the rest of the province beyond the river, greeting. And now the letter that you sent to us have been plainly read before me. And I made a decree, and search has been made, and it has been found that the city from of old has risen against the kings, and the rebellion and sedition have been made in it. And mighty kings have been over Jerusalem, who ruled over the whole province beyond the river, to whom tribute, custom, and toll were paid. Therefore make a decree that these men be made to cease, and that the city not be rebuilt until a decree is made by me. And take care not to be slack in this matter. Why should damage grow to the hurt of the king? Then when the copy of King Artaxerxes' letter was written before Rehum and Shimshai, the scribe and their associates, they went in haste to the Jews in Jerusalem and by force and power made them cease. Then the work on the house of God that is in Jerusalem stopped, and it ceased until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. There was a pastor named, and I believe he's still alive, Pastor Chuck Swindoll, who wrote a book back in the 80s called 3 Steps Forward, 2 Steps Back. And I think what we see is that in our series here in Ezra, that perfectly describes what is happening. We've been seeing in Ezra that God had stirred up the heart of the pagan king to issue a decree for his people to go back to Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple, one step forward. And then we also see that God at the same time stirred the hearts of thousands of Jewish people to go leave Babylon, to leave the comforts of their home, and head and to do this arduous task of rebuilding the temple and the city. Another step forward. And then what we see is we saw the past 2 weeks when Ryan preached that they were there and they rebuilt the altar, made sacrifices, they laid the foundation of the temple, they began to celebrate the Feast of Booths. They began to follow the Lord 3 steps forward. And then all of a sudden we come to chapter 4. What happens? The enemy hit and the work of the temple stopped. 1 step back. The work ended up ceasing for 16 long years. Another step back. But they were still in the land. They were still being blessed by God. They were having children. And for a while, their crops were being blessed. Wow, another step forward. But there was no place to worship God in Jerusalem. Another step back. Isn't that kind of what life is like? We have, our spiritual journey is a conglomeration of highs and lows, mountain peaks and valleys, wins and losses, successes and setbacks. I also like what the great philosopher Forrest Gump says. You guys remember the movie Forrest Gump? There's a lot of good words, but he says one, that life is like a box of chocolates. Does anybody know what he says? You never know what you're going to get. And that's true. You go, and husbands, you sit there and say, oh no, it's Valentine's Day. So you forget to buy chocolate. So you go on February 15th when the chocolate's half price. And you buy 2 boxes to make up that you forgot Valentine's Day. So you give one to your wife and you keep one for yourself. And you open it up and all these chocolates, assorted chocolates are there. Chocolate-covered cherries. And you begin to eat those. It's so good. And you reach down and you pick another one up that you think is a chocolate-covered cherry. You bite into it. It's coconut. Nasty. You see, that's what life is like. We have these victories. We have these successes. We follow God. We are blessed by God. And all of a sudden, we have these setbacks. And I think what Ezra is trying to tell us in this passage, what God is trying to tell us is that our journey to restoration, we should enjoy our successes and also endure our setbacks. And that's kind of what we're looking at here, is that as we are succeeding, as God is blessing us, we need to enjoy those. We need to rejoice in the return, rejoice in what's happened, but we also need to endure our setbacks. Hey, gentlemen up there hey, go ahead and there you go. Thank you. We need to endure them because life is not just going to be happy days all the time. There will be days when there's zero money or there's be more bills than there is at the end of the month than you have money. We will live life. We will become sick. We will have relationship problems. We will be tested. We will experience opposition in our life personally and corporately as a church. And that's what we see here. We see in Ezra chapter 4 that right off the success of laying the foundation of the temple, right as they were rejoicing that God is doing something great, He has kept His promises, He is blessing us, all of a sudden opposition comes. Setback comes. So how do we how do we face these setbacks? What type of setbacks, what do these setbacks happen? How should we describe them? Well, I think the first thing we can see is that setbacks can be sudden. That the opposition, that these lows can be sudden. Now you think about it. When you're up at the top of the mountain, there's only one place to go, right? That's down to the valley to go up to the mountain. Setbacks can be sudden. Look at verse 1 of chapter 4. Now, when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that they had returned, exiles were building a temple to the Lord, the God of Israel, the scripture calls these people that were around them, their neighbors, were enemies. And we see that they came and says, hey, let us help you build this temple. Now, these enemies, these people that were around Jerusalem, were not there giving them a casserole, say, welcome to the neighborhood. We're not there just sitting there saying, hey, let us just help you get moved in. No. They were there. They had their own sinister reasons. They were wanting to infiltrate what the Jews were doing because they saw these thousands, tens of thousands of people come in. And they say, if we don't do something, this city, this temple is going to be our downfall. The Jews are going to be great. And they basically, what they come in, they say, they were very subtle. They say, and they approached Zerubbabel and they said, let us build with you, for we worship the God as you do. And we've been sacrificing to him since Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, has brought us here. So you can go back to 2 Kings, I think chapter 17 and read this, but what has happened is before Jerusalem was destroyed, before Nebuchadnezzar came and destroyed the city, the Syrians destroyed northern Israel. They took the 10 tribes away, and then they brought people in. And what happened is that over the generations, generation after generation, the Jews that were left there began to intermarry. And with them, they brought their own religions. So by the time, 70, 80 years later, a couple generations later, we see that those that were in the north, that were not a part of the remnant coming back, they may have been saying, oh yeah, we worship Jehovah, we give them sacrifices, but they were also sacrificing to all these little gods on the side. Syncretism. They didn't have the religion of the one true God, Jehovah, like the Jewish people. They had the religion of Cracker Barrel. Whatever God they wanted to worship at that time is what they worshipped. And what we see is that their leaders saw through this opposition. And that's what happened. And they said, nope, we don't want anything to do about it. We will build this alone. You have no part in this. And this is where opposition begins. It begins when we begin to work for the Lord. It didn't start as they entered the land. No. It didn't start when they began to think about building. It began when they actually started building the temple. Opposition began when they made a decision to follow God's command. Opposition begins when they had their priorities right. They were building the temple, doing what God wanted them to do, and all of a sudden, bam, they hit a wall, and opposition comes. If you talk to my son, he says, I am an excellent deer hunter. Isn't that right, Aiden? No. In fact, his name for me in his phone is Can't Shoot. I'm a very novice at deer hunting. But I was reading and once someone says, when you go deer hunting, you don't look for deer. You look for movement. You look and listen for movement in the forest. And when you see movement, you begin to focus and then you see the deer. You need to make sure it's the deer and not another hunter before you shoot. The deer's not going to be visible a lot of times, but at least you can hear and see the movement of the deer. And that's exactly what our greatest enemy, Satan, does. First Peter says that be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone who he can devour. So when a predator comes, he can smell, he can see the movement of his prey. And that's what was happening. When they talked about the building, Satan wasn't worried about it. When they investigated the building, they're still not doing it. When they talked about it, when they even formed a committee about it, the devil wasn't there. But when they actually started to follow through, that's when opposition came. We need to understand that the level of spiritual warfare, the level of opposition that we experience as Christians, as a church, is directly proportional to the level of work you are attempting to do for God. The more that we follow God, the more that we obey Him, and the more that we are on target and working for God, the more opposition, the more setbacks we will face. Not because we're doing the wrong thing, but because we're doing the right thing. So we not only see the opposition as sudden, but secondly, we see that the setbacks can be persistent. So verses 4-7 has a lot of names of the king. Now, we need to understand as we read this, up until chapter 4, from chapter 1 all the way to basically chapter 4, verse 5, is chronological. Ezra is telling a story about what's happened. But what we see in verses 6 all the way to 23 is letters that went back and forth between Israel's adversaries and the kings over an 80 to 100 year period. In fact, the letter that we read, the long letter, was not even dated. It was dated to a king that was ruling under Nehemiah. That was over Nehemiah's time. And there were 4 kings mentioned here: Cyrus, Darius, Ahasuerus, and Artaxerxes. Now you sit there and say, well, Pastor, who in the world are those? It's not like the presidents. How many of you have ever seen the movie 300? That king that sits and they carry him around on that big thing? That is Xerxes. That was Ahasuerus. So what we see is that the opposition to Israel didn't just happen just for a little bit. It went on and on and on and on. It covered, and these are not all the kings. It covered probably 5 or 6 different kingdoms, monarchies, rules. And what we see is that it started under Cyrus. Cyrus died 9 years after his edict. Another king comes forward, and then the opposition happened under King Darius. And this may or may not have been the king in Daniel chapter 6. We don't know. Then it happened in the next king, Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, which was the husband of what book of the Bible named after her? Esther. So Esther was happening during this time. And then Artaxerxes also came as well. So this would last for well over 100 years. So and not only that, it was persistent. It happened a long time. But if you look at verse 9, I'm not going to read it again, but look at all the people who signed these letters. It was not just one group of people, but it was everybody was against the Israelites in building the temple and rebuilding the city. So it was the opposition was persistent. It kept going and going and going like the Energizer Bunny. And it was being done all over them. There was no safety around them at all. But see, this is exactly how Satan does his unrelenting opposition. He does not give up after one attack, but he keeps on countering whatever the Lord's people try to do and move ahead spiritually. He tries to thwart. So we need to understand that as we do God's work, as you follow God's command in your family, in your work, as a church, and even in your personal life, don't be surprised when opposition comes. And understand, be prepared that it will continue as long as you are faithful to God. The next thing we see in verses 4 and 5 is that setbacks can be all-encompassing. It's personal. It affects not just, our physicalness, but it affects everything. Verses 4 and 5 says that the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build and bribe counselors against them to frustrate their purpose. All the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So we're going back and forth between time factors, so we're going back here. But what we see is that if you read this letter, they use discouragement, intimidation, they use fear tactics. They lied about them. They slandered. They even tried to do a guilt trip on them. And that's what we see. We see going forth and look at verse 5. They discouraged them and they were afraid to build. And they bribed counselors to frustrate their purpose. What we see is that word, that idea can carry the meaning of making them ineffective. It can even suggest impotence. That's what opposition can do. Maybe not so much temporary opposition, but the kind that goes on day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, can make us to the point to where we just want to give up. We're just not useful anymore. We're worn down. We're discouraged. We're fearful. That's exactly what happens. And they accused the people of Israel for doing things that they didn't do. And also guilt tripped them. And you go back and you look at verses 13. They stated the remnants. They lied about the intent that they basically said the Jews are never going to pay taxes. Well, if you want to get a king's attention, what do? You affect the purse. All these people are not going to pay taxes. They're going to rebel against you. They're not going to be faithful to you. Not only that, but they brought back the whole reason. They brought back the actions of their forefathers. Well, the reason, go back into the records. See that these people, the city was destroyed because they were rebellious. So why are you giving them the city before? They guilt-tripped it. They guilt-tripped them. And see, that's what we need to understand, is that our opposition, our enemy Satan, wants to lie about us. He's always accusing us. Day and night, he stands before the Father to accuse us. And then what happens is that we believe these lies. We believe, and he puts a guilt trip on us, and that we're not worthy to be the children of God. That when we mess up, when we sin, all of a sudden, Satan goes, see, you're not God's child. You're not saved. So he tries to guilt us. He tries to lie about us, and we begin to believe it. But he's right. We are not worthy. We're not worthy ourselves to come before God. The reason, but we are worthy, not on the basis of who we are and what we've done, but we're worthy on the basis of what Christ has done. When we come to Christ and we accept the gospel and know that we need to be forgiven of our sins, and we come and we want to follow Christ, and we want to have Christ as King of our life, what happens? He takes away all of our sin as far as east is from the west. We are no longer under the wrath of God, and we are given the righteousness of Christ. So that when God sees us, he doesn't see David, who's a terrible sinner, who did this, who did that. No, he sees Christ and the cross that has paid for all of those sins. But if we're not careful, we will allow our enemy to make our walk ineffective. We can never lose our salvation, but he can make our witness ineffective because he is persistent, because he is conniving, and he will do anything to stop us from being used by God to share the hope that we have inside of us. Lastly, we see this idea that setbacks can be devastating. Look at verse 24. Look at verse 24. Look what happened. After all this letter writing, back and forth, look what happened. Then the work of the house of God that is in Jerusalem stopped, and it ceased until the second year of the reign of Darius, the king of Persia. The opposition was successful. The enemies got to the Jews and they stopped building the temple. They quit. They gave up. They threw their hands up and says, I quit. I can't do this anymore. We can't handle it. You ever been in that position? Just can't handle them. And I think they're right. They were right. They couldn't handle it themselves. They couldn't handle the opposition, and neither can we. Neither we as a church, neither can we as individual or as a church handle that opposition alone. And the day that we think that we have it together is the day that we are defeated, just like the Israelites. You see, facing opposition, facing setback is something that not only the remnant had to deal with, not only people far away, but it's something that we have to deal with in our regular, everyday life. Opposition is something that we will face as an individual walk in our walk with Christ. How do we deal with it? How do we battle opposition and setbacks in our life? Well, 3 quick things as I end today. Number 1, how do we respond? Number 1 is that we need to stand firm. We need to stand firm. You know, even though we see that later on, you can read the books of Haggai and stuff like that, you can see that they did end up sinning, and we're going to talk about that later on, that they allowed the opposition to get to them. At first, they stayed firm. If you look at verses 1 through 7, you begin to think, wow, these people, no, they were discerning. They knew that the people who were trying to oppose them wanted to join them, infiltrate them, but they said no. They stood firm. They knew what was happening. They were not duped by their adversaries. They were not surprised by the opposition. And they kept going. They said, no, we are going to do what Cyrus asked us to do. We're going to keep doing what God has told us to do, no matter the consequences. You see, God is glorified when the weak overcome the strong by faith. The idea of how do we stand firm, not in our own strength, but in the strength of Christ. And no matter how the odds may be stacked against God and his people, all of Satan's triumphs will come to nothing in the end. Yeah, he may win some skirmishes, he may win some battles until the end, but we know that we win and he loses. He knows that God wins and he loses. So what do? We stand firm. We draw near to God, as James chapter 4 says. Draw near to him and stand firm. Not only that, but we need to stay focused. If you notice what is happening here, the one thing that you notice is that they're not alone in their opposition. It's not just the leaders, it's not just Zerubbabel, it's not just the high priest, it's not just this one family and another family. They're all united against this opposition. They're not facing it alone. You know, and so what happens is that I love to watch National Geographic. I love to watch those movies where they talk about animals. If you go to Yosemite National Park, I've never been there, but I watched a documentary on it. But or Yellowstone, whatever it may be, and they have the herd of bison, and it's in the springtime, and they're running through the field, and on the outlying of the herd are wolves. What are they doing? They're waiting for those who are by themselves, and they go as a pack to attack it. As long as you're with the herd, you're safe. But if you're straggling behind or you're a little weak and you separate yourself from the herd, guess what? You're going to be primed to be eaten. You are the prey. And I think that's what happens is that they were together. We see that God sent them great leaders like Ezra, Zerubbabel, and Nehemiah to encourage them and to keep the goal in mind and keep building. Not only that, but God also sent in 3 prophets, Zechariah, Haggai, and Malachi. You know, we went through Haggai a couple years ago about this time. And they came when God needed to correct them. And we too have the same help to keep our eyes on Jesus. God has given us a local church to spur us on to good works. You know, that's the reason I know that you guys don't come to church just to hear me preach. You know, it may be a good thing, but that's not the only reason why. Why do we come to church? It's because we want to be encouraged by one another. You guys love that talking. It takes forever for Ryan to get your attention because you're talking to one another, and that's good. And that's your purpose. You are here to encourage one another and to spur them on. That when they are down, you're there to help them pick them up. When they're feeling weak, you're to help them, to strengthen them, and to pick them up and carry them along. And I think that's one thing we understand, that when you separate yourself from a local body of Christ, and you decide, well, you know, I can just listen online, I can just listen through podcast, what happens? You're like that bison that's out there all by himself. And it doesn't take long before the opposition begins to beat you down and devour you because you don't have any support around you. He's not only giving you the church, he's giving you his word to help you see the goal. If you stay in the word, your eyes stay on Christ. Not only that, but he's given us leaders, pastors, and teachers to correct us and help us obey when we need it. We need to stand firm in what God has called us to do and also stay focused and primed on Christ. And I was going to have you turn to 2 Corinthians, but the time is short. But 2 Corinthians chapter 12 talks about Paul, who you know, he didn't go to seminary. He had the best seminary education like that. Christ appeared to him personally and took him through seminary. Man, that's great. I loved my education at Southern, but man, I would love to have that. And he goes on and says that because of that, to keep me humble, God sent a thorn in his side, allowed a thorn in his side. He allowed testing, he allowed opposition, he allowed suffering to keep him humble. Paul even says that he prayed for 3 times and says, Lord, remove this thorn. But God says, my sufficient is perfect. You know, my grace is sufficient for you. And what did Paul do? In all that suffering, he remained faithful. He kept doing what God told him to do. It didn't matter if his life was in danger and he had to be let down in the middle of the night over the wall to escape with his life. It didn't matter how many times he'd been to prison. It didn't matter if he was suffering, had to appear before the Roman consul. He remained faithful. That's what we are to do. We are to remain faithful when opposition happens. Yes, it will be hard. We will be discouraged. We will be fearful. We will sit there and go, what next? But we are called to do that. If we are headed in the direction we are supposed to do as a church, as individuals, we are going to face opposition. And as we get closer to where we're supposed to be in God's plan, we're going to face tougher opposition. So the choice is that we can choose to face it by ourselves, just grin and bear it and survive it, and we'll end up like the Israelites in 16 years. All we have left is a crumbled down altar and just a shell of a temple. The only thing that we can do is allow us, if we stand in the strength of Christ, if we face our opposition in his power and his might, and not in our own. My question today, as Ryan comes and sings the 3 verses of I have decided to follow Jesus, are you ready to follow Christ? Are you ready to stand in the face of opposition today? If you are, then quit looking at the opposition. Quit focusing on what the hardship and the suffering that you're going through, and focus on Christ. Look to Christ. Trust Christ. Lean on Jesus. Call upon Jesus for salvation. Make sure that you are a child of God. If you are a child of God, there is nothing the accuser, nothing the opposition can do to thwart his love for you. Because he will give you the strength to stand today, tomorrow, and forevermore.